Welcome to episode 224 of KT Confidential, the real estate podcast. In today's episode, we talk about what happens when you can't close on your home purchase. So today, follow up from episode 223, where we talked about home buyers being in a desperate situation and this whole thing about people complaining about the new home prices being much lower.
They want the onus to be on the builders.
They want the onus to be on the builder,
them,
blah, blah, blah,
compensate
blah,
them.
blah. If you didn't watch it, go and watch it. Today, we're talking about what happens if I can't close on my home purchase.
Which everyone in that article should probably watch because
Or listen.
Because
you can listen to this podcast anywhere.
That's right.
Anywhere.
Hey, just on a side note, so today I started, it's one of my favorite ways to start the day, is going to Glen Eden, getting an hour of snowboarding in. And when I'm there, whether by myself or with Alicia or with the kids, we always take the stairs up. I don't know the last time you were there, but there's two elevators and then there's this set of stairs that go to the top. You take a bridge across the railway to get to the hill. And we always take the stairs. And today was a great example of why. There was somebody... When I arrived, they were stuck in the elevator. And when I left, they were still stuck in the elevator.
Ooh, that sucks.
Yeah. Anyways, that brings us to this podcast.
Awful segue.
It is. There's actually no connection whatsoever other than me physically being here.
Glen Eden is actually a bit of a hidden gem in Milton. Like a lot of people moving to Milton for the first time, they don't know that Kelso has a nice little beach. You can rent canoes and kayaks. You can
if you're
go
into mountain biking.
If you're into climbing, mountain biking, hiking.
Yeah. Well, when I'm there,
picnicking,
yeah. I don't spend much time there in the summer because for me it's more snowboarding. But in the winter, when I'm going up on the lift, if I go in the morning by myself, I meet people from all over. There's people coming from Scarborough, Markham, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo. Like people drive a fair distance for that hill. I wouldn't. It's not that good.
Yeah, but for a 7-minute drive from home,
it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. A quick tip for anybody new to Milton: get yourself a conservation Halton pass for the season, family pass. It's a great investment. You've got some great conservation areas close by.
What is the season?
I don't know. I think it's the year, actually, because all these conservation areas
trails are still open.
Yeah, depending on condition, and like Mount Nemo as an example, there are some times where they close it off because if there's too much ice on the paths, it becomes dangerous.
And they're probably not groomed.
No.
There's probably some paths that are for cross-country skiing or snowshoeing, whatever, but fewer.
Anyways. So, all right. Can't close on my new house.
Can't close on my new house. We've had this happen representing, I don't think I've ever had it happen representing the buyer, but I've been on the other end of it a few times where the buyers of properties we had for sale couldn't close. And I'll let you take over.
You're just a wealth of knowledge today.
Well, I don't want to take, because last time I started talking, you're like, you're taking my points. You're taking all my points.
You are liable for the expenses and the shortfall after the property resells. So,
more.
And more.
I just want to add that in. I will cite an article.
For those of you listening, Adrian got very interactive with his hands up when he said that. Let's give an example. Buyer purchased the home, $1 million. Can't close. Had a $50,000 5% deposit.
Sounds like a very specific example.
No, it's not. It's a very realistic example. Buyer doesn't want to close, can't sell their home, whatever. Seller still needs to sell their house, goes back on the market. It resells for $900,000. There's now a shortfall of $100,000. The cost of reselling it and the cost of that shortfall can be, I'll keep it vague because this is all up to lawyers and the courts, because you will be...
It's not to be taken lightly.
It's not to be taken lightly. You will be sued. Most likely.
Most likely. Unless you just...
And you are liable for any of the expenses.
And more.
And more. So it could be costly. Now, there could be negotiation to avoid litigation. So the buyer's lawyer could go to the seller's lawyer. And by the way, realtors at that point probably are not involved in that equation.
Should not be.
And should not be.
Speaking to realtors, stay out of it. Direct them to their lawyers. Let them handle it.
And to the purchaser and buyer, it's probably best you leave it to your lawyer to handle this situation because there could be litigation. So to avoid going to court, those two lawyers may have negotiation back and forth. So as an example, the buyer might say to the seller's lawyer that they'll forgo the deposit if you sign a mutual release. So in this case, if the buyer can't close, doesn't want to close, whatever, they have $50,000 on the line, their lawyer might go to the seller's lawyer and say, hey, we'll forego the $50,000 deposit. You guys keep that, but we want a mutual release to release us of any legal liability. We're totally out, but you keep the $50,000.
Yeah.
The seller might look at it and say, well, we still think we can sell it for $1 million if we go back on the market, so we're ahead. So that could happen.
Be cautious as the seller, though, in terms of agreeing to anything without the direction of your lawyer, because if you agree to accept compensation of any sort, that could be considered you establishing an agreement with the buyer and releasing them of all responsibility.
Correct.
What I was getting excited about and saying and more, there was a story, and I probably talked about this before. There was a story in Toronto, a house sold. I don't know what the numbers were at the top of my head and selling price, but the buyer couldn't close. The buyer had $100,000 deposit on this home they had purchased. So the seller ultimately resold, and they resold for $100,000 more than the original buyer paid. Mm-hmm. So now they've got a $100,000 deposit from the original buyer and a $100,000 higher selling price. They went to court, and the court awarded the seller the deposit. So even though there was no loss in that situation,
there was a contractual obligation.
Right. So yeah, definitely not to be taken lightly. Now, what can you do? I would say the best advice I would have for a buyer, aside from consulting your lawyer first, is don't leave it to the last minute. It's good to try to figure things out early. And maybe you've got a seller on the other end of the equation that's empathetic, and they've been in your shoes before, or they appreciate and they have sympathy for you, and maybe they'll work with you.
It usually happens this scenario usually happens in the shift of a market, not oftentimes when things in the market are steady eddy that you have deals going sideways because a buyer can't close. So in this circumstance, we're a 16% reduction in the average home price year over year right now. And on a $2 million purchase, you're talking a $320,000 swing. So much like in the last episode when we spoke about buying and selling in the same market, that's number one. You need to have your home, if it's not already listed or sold, and you're planning on buying first and then selling, you need to ensure your home is going to be ready to go on the market pretty quickly. Like, don't all of a sudden start painting and doing those maintenance repairs, and then waiting for the property to be staged, photographed, and on the market. Because then you're talking maybe a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 week spread.
Yeah.
And you can see a significant shift in the market during that period of time. The other factor is don't overestimate the value of your home. In fact, you should underestimate to allow for that cushion in what you are comfortable in your range of spending.
Well, the challenge there too, though, is a lot of homeowners may be very disconnected from the market and have no idea, so they're relying on their realtor, who may
Or they're bringing in a realtor too late into that equation.
That happens a lot.
That happens very often.
But a lot of buyers, I think they feel like, okay, well, that's my best scenarios. I can't close. I can't afford, I'm a couple $100,000 short of being able to afford to close now for whatever circumstances have occurred. So the outcome though is, okay, well, you can close and be stretching yourself financially, or you can not close and still have to absorb that loss. Now you just don't have a house to show for it.
Yeah.
Right? Like if the seller now sells for $200,000 less and they sue you for that, you're still stuck in your townhouse instead of the nice detached house, and you've had to take another $200,000 mortgage to pay that.
Right. That's an awful position to be in.
That would not be fun.
We had one of those instances.
Yeah.
And the seller won. They won the shortfall, and it went to court. They won the shortfall, plus all of the additional. We got paid twice.
Yeah.
So,
well, carrying costs, hydro, property taxes, everything.
Right. All the new staging costs, the new realtor costs, additional lawyer fees. You're paying all the lawyer fees in the lawsuit. So
it's interesting though. It is generally only when there's a big market shift. That's when we see it the most. But there was one other time it happened where the buyer, I think this is going back a long time. I think the buyer was going through a divorce. So they bought a condo and then they decided not to get divorced. Do you remember that?
No.
This is going back probably close to 9 years.
It could happen if you lose a job.
Sure.
Or there's a death in, one of the associated pieces of the puzzle. So one of the buyers or a buyer's family. Or
I wonder what would happen there. What if you bought it jointly with your spouse and your spouse died?
Ooh, great question.
Would the contract be null and void now because the person's no longer around?
Please refer to your lawyer.
Yeah. Because I think if a house burns down, you can't close on the transaction because what's being transacted doesn't exist. So if one of the parties dies, does that nullify the agreement? We should find out.
That and more in an upcoming episode of KT Confidential, the real estate podcast.
With a lawyer as a guest.
All right. Well, we talked about everything there. So if anybody has any comments, any experience or history with a similar situation, we'd love to hear your feedback. As always, we'll see you next week. Bye. Thanks for listening or watching. Make sure you subscribe. Do us a solid. Thank you.